Hello and welcome to another edition of the Presidents, Prime Ministers and Kings and Queens podcast. I'm Ian Dale. Today we are going to talk about, I think, the monarch that virtually everyone in Britain would agree is one of the most famous and possibly also most infamous. And to talk about King Henry VIII, well, who else would you have but Dr. David Starkey?
Who was also famous and infamous.
Well, I wasn't going to say that. I wasn't going to draw any parallels whatsoever. Now,
certainly not signifies, yes.
I mean, obviously, when I was putting the book together, I thought, well, who do I want to write about Henry VIII? I mean, you are like the world's authority on Henry VIII. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that from time to time, you would send me an email saying, I've got a new discovery and I'm not quite sure how to sort of approach it. And I think you've written one of the most original chapters in the book, and it is you haven't written the sort of just conventional sort of biographical stuff. There is a real theme to this. So let's start off with that, and then we'll move on to the more sort of general aspects of his life. So what did you find out?
Right, going back to the first serious book, as opposed to formal academic books that I did on Henry's daughter, second daughter, Elizabeth, which was a book on her formation. I called it Apprenticeship. Yeah. Her education, her terrifying experiences under her father, her brother, her sister. And Elizabeth is not only bastardized when she's the age of 3, but of course she's fully conscious and knows about it. She comes within a whisker of being executed by her own sister. I mean, extraordinary. I became very aware of the importance of the formation, the education in the life of a monarch, as in my life, as in your life. It's very difficult to do because it's a period that tends to be very obscure. Even though these are famous people, the degree of documentation you will normally find is tiny. And I set myself the quest because, of course, I sort of backed into doing Henry VIII's biography. My great teacher, Geoffrey Elton, had a view, I hardly dare say the words, I've got to attribute them to Geoffrey, that biography was for women. It was the kind of things that ladies...
See, that's the kind of talk that gets you into trouble, David.
I've carefully cited authority. It was the kind of thing that Lady Antonia did, and he regarded it with the utmost contempt, and he was, of course, wrong.
Completely.
He was completely wrong.
I'll tell you what, this book wouldn't exist without...
It wouldn't exist, and nor would human history. No. I mean, the trouble is, so many historians have tended to treat history as a series of abstract nouns. I remember when I was at Cambridge, I described it as being like a scene out of P.G. Wodehouse. You remember Bertie Wodehouse? Bertie had a thing about ants, these terrifying creatures called ants. There's a wonderful scene, ant calling to ant, like brontosauruses across the primeval swamp. Well, Cambridge history was abstract noun, calling to abstract noun with nary a person. I recognised then that's wrong. And I began with a group biography of those who surrounded Henry, the inner court. And then more and more, of course, you became aware there was this mystery in the heart of it all. Henry, and Henry himself, a man in many ways who is infinitely well known, and yet in some ways utterly unknowable. If you look to his daughter keeps extraordinarily personal details. She writes prayers. She writes her own speeches. You can actually see how ideas are shaped and formed. Henry is oblique. You're always getting into him from the side. And I had the great good luck when I first started this exercise. It's real excavation. It's going into obscure things. I was first of all, and this is going back to the 1990s, I first of all had the inspiration that we'd all been looking in the wrong place for the evidence of his upbringing. We'd been looking in one financial department, the newfangled one, the chamber, and not looking in the exchequer. And I found all the evidence in the Exchequer records that Henry had been brought up by women until he was in his early teens, which is pretty odd for a boy now. and was wildly strange for a boy then. It's a reflection of the fact that he's the second son, that his elder brother Arthur is intended to be king. So that was one enormously important fact, and that really conditioned and it shaped my first attempt at a life of the young Henry.
So you found original papers
totally
that nobody else had come across.
Yeah, but they'd not understood them, and when you looked at them at first, they were deeply boring.
Right.
They were lists of minor people running the royal nursery, and what you were then able to show was these were the people actually running Henry's life virtually until he's until he's an early teenager. And this, you see, struck me as being profoundly important. We tend to think of Henry as a woman hater. Not at all. Henry loves women too well. He's a serial monogamist. I mean, remember, there's that wonderful phrase.
That people are going to find that really weird that you say that, given that he had 6 wives.
Yeah, but serial, that means one after the other.
Yeah, I know.
He doesn't have loads of mistresses. And there are not loads of bastards.
And that's unusual, isn't it?
Very, very.
Goes right through the monarchs that we cover in the book. Actually, all of them are womanizers.
Henry is a serial monogamist. Henry, you see, this extraordinary thing of being brought up with women means he can't do without them. I think fundamentally, and again, we've just not got this right, Henry's a romantic. Henry believes... You're about to go off and deal with Cliff Richards. Henry believes in love. He believes in love in the full Liverpudlian sense. He actually uses the phrase in one of the few really personal things he writes, his song, which is very much the equivalent, by the way, of a pop song of the early 16th century, Pastime with Good Company. You can tell it's a pop song because fashionable clergy use it as a text in sermons, just as these silly people of the Church of England do now with the Beatles or whatever. Anyway, so there is that early study. What I did for the thing that's called Henry Virtuous Prince looked very much at this if you like, the gender to use a fashionable word, the gender context of Henry's upbringing. I got some glimpses in that of the other great aspect, which is in other words, what we would call formation. The other thing, of course, is actual education. And I got some of it right in that book, but I got an awful lot wrong. What I got right in that book, written actually for his anniversary, the anniversary of his accession, I've had incredible luck, Ian, in my life. All the great Henry VIII anniversaries have coincided with my own life. I was able to do the exhibition for his birth, the exhibition for his accession. I'm determined to make it until 2047. Cart it in, do the final obit. Anyway, what I got right about it was which again is a point I make very heavily in this book, that Henry's education becomes quite unusually sophisticated. After his brother dies, when Henry's aged 11, and Henry becomes heir, he suddenly his education goes up a notch from being educated by a tutor, a very remarkable tutor, John Skelton, but whose Latin is very, very old-fashioned. He suddenly gets absolute cutting-edge stuff. The Latin that is directly shaped by the great Dutch scholar Erasmus. He's taught by a man called John Holt, who is the outstanding schoolmaster of his day. He then has a kind of, it's called Socius Studiorum, companion of studies. It's a kind of big brother figure who is Lord Mountjoy, a member of the peerage, but had also himself directly studied with Erasmus in Paris. He's very, very handsome man, and Erasmus had tendencies in that direction. So their relationship was incredibly close. So Henry has this incredibly fashionable Latin education, and this lays one of the absolute foundations for what will happen in the reign, because Henry, of course, is a king of words. The king of the extraordinary acts of Parliament, of the declaration that he's supreme head of the church, a king who actually makes himself the real direct determinant of what people have to believe in England, and the king who launches, of course, that great translation, the translation of the Bible into English, and all of that. All of that was there. What is the novelty of this book and it's a really absolutely fundamental one. And it is, I think it genuinely new, and it not only rebalances Henry, it potentially rebalances how we understand the early 16th century, how we understand the history of our governing class. Henry, yes, indeed, he has that education in Erasmian Latin. But what we've forgotten, and what I got completely wrong, and everybody else has got wrong, is, of course, Henry didn't only receive a mental education, he received a physical education. I don't know about you, I went to an old-fashioned grammar school where there was still the echo of the great public tradition of a healthy mind in a healthy body, the emphasis on sport. And with Henry, of course, it took the form of jousting. He wasn't allowed actually to joust under his father. It's incredibly dangerous. It is rugby on horseback, with the avowed intention of injuring your opponent rather than pretending you don't want to. And it is done by exactly the kind of people who play rugby. Big, tall, strapping, strong lads, who like thumping. And Henry, who turns out to be hugely tall and strong. I mean, he's not quite as big as his grandfather, Edward IV, who is when his body was exhumed in the 18th century, his skeleton, after all the shrinkage, was 6'4". I mean, Henry's
highly unusual for that time.
Well, I don't think so. I think that the Plantagenets tend to be big. Not all of them, but most of them tend to be big, strapping men. There's also a distinct strain in the English upper class. You can still see it. I mean, I've spent most of my life looking up to people with double-barrel names, and there is that. I mean, Henry, for example, could muster round his court 4 or 5 people who, when they're in disguise, would pass for him. So it's not all that. It really is not all that unusual. So Henry then is trained in jousting, and it's the training exercise of riding at what's called riding at the ring, in which you actually, rather than aiming the lance at somebody else, you aim to send it through an obstacle, which is swinging with a weight at the back that can clobber you if you don't actually do it properly. It's incredibly good training for the accurate direction of the lance, and all this seemed very strange because, of course, I have no idea, because I haven't read it, what the chapter on Henry VII says, but conventionally Henry VII is supposed to be the peaceful king, the king who wants to avoid war, who is far too sensible and counts his pennies and doesn't do any of that. And in that first book, I puzzled and I agonized and I thought, why on earth is his father allowing him to do this? Why is this happening? And then, of course, when I was doing your essay, and on the back of a lot of extensive work that I've been doing over the last decade, I had this flash of revelation. It's intended. It's deliberate. And it's deliberate in 2 ways. And for 2 reasons. There's a very big picture stuff and there's very small picture stuff. The big picture stuff is, once again, we've got Henry VII completely wrong. Towards the end of his reign, Henry VII knows the 100 Years' War has to be resumed. France, as always, has got too big for its boots and has got to be taken down a notch, and he plots quite deliberately to elevate a rival power to France, to elevate the House of Habsburg, and he does it to begin with by subsidizing them with inconceivably huge amounts of money. So Henry's training is training which is actually deliberately directed to war. So that's the big picture. The smaller picture is, again, I re-understood the idea of education, because although we're all very... Those of us who were sad enough to do this for a living are completely familiar with the idea of the New Latin of the 16th century, which supplies the main curriculum of the grammar schools right through to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is the end of the process of Henry VIII in the same way as Henry VIII was the beginning. But there's another figure that we've completely forgotten about, and I think he's actually much more important, Baldassare Castiglione. And whereas Erasmus comes from the Northern Renaissance, the Renaissance of the Netherlands, Northern France, England, and so on, Castiglione comes from the heart of Italy, from which is actually the real centre of the whole thing. And Castiglione writes, and this again is strikingly important, Erasmus's concerns are primarily about religion. Castiglione's concerns are primarily about politics and the art of manipulation in politics. And he produces this wonderful book called The Book of the Courtier. And I remember first reading it and thinking, this is me. You know, I studied the royal court, and this is a book on how to be a courtier. It's a book on how to survive, and you know what? If only the people who were revealing themselves as fools in the Downing Street apps had read the Book of the Courtier, they would have received precise instructions that would have stopped them making such a hash of it. Anyway, history really does have very direct use. But the thing that's remarkable about the Castiglione book is that it envisages this two-sided education, the education in war, the education in the arts of being a gentleman. Remember, being a gentleman has always been about violence. It's controlled violence. The mark of a gentleman is you carry a sword. The mark, the visible mark, is a shield. A shield is literally a shield, but it has the heraldic descriptions on it that define your family. So it's the combination of the Latin, the rhetorical skills, the persuasive skills that Erasmus talks about, but also linked with the typical physicality, the training in honour, glory, and war. So, fine, that all is very sensible. But then, I knew vaguely, Castiglione actually comes to England. He actually visits the court of Henry VII on behalf of his master, the Duke of Urbino. It's a lovely story, that, by the way. The Duke of Urbino has been awarded the Garter. The Garter, the most prestigious order in Christendom. It's a fascinating story, and I think it probably explains quite a lot of the recent promotions to the Garter, in the detail to which I am not going to go. But it was a done deal. Henry VII wanted what's called a dispensation, which is the thing that will enable Henry VIII, Prince Henry as he was then, to marry his sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, but also to get a special permission for Henry VII to appoint, I think, a more sympathetic confessor. And there's a new pope, Julius II. And Julius II, these proposals are put to him. It's really very, very difficult. It really can't. This is going to be very problematic. So the Pope refers the matter to the Cardinal in charge of English affairs, a man called Adriano Castellesi. And there is a wonderful series of dog Latin letters. We've only got Castiglione's side of the Castellesi's side of the correspondence, written to Henry VII. And and Cardinal Adriano explains the negotiations with the Pope. The case is put that the king really does need these dispensations. Oh, absolutely impossible. Inconceivable. Far too difficult. By the way, there is my nephew. His father, was a Knight of the Garter. I think, it is really important. Cardinal Adriano, utterly impossible, inconceivable. The greatest princes in Europe are denied the Garter. 3 days later, they decide 2 impossibles equals 1 done deal. So that's why Castiglione comes here to receive the Garter, and he gives a speech which the young Henry listens to, in which he outlines the Book of the Courtier. He describes his own master, the Duke of Urbino, as excelling in the arts of peace and war. And this is what we've forgotten. We've forgotten that people like Erasmus and Thomas More are pretty well unique in thinking war is a bad thing. Everybody else thought war was a good thing. And you know what? We're in the middle, I think, of the consequences of that. And one of the things that's gone wrong with the horrors that are happening in the Middle East at the moment is that we've forgotten the purposes of war. War exists for a purpose. It exists to act as a judgment. There is that term, the arbitrament of war. It exists for a purpose, to decide conflicts which are otherwise undecidable. Right? And they understood that. Or at least Castiglione did. Erasmus didn't. Castiglione did. And it was entirely appropriate that Henry should have this training. In other words, this is a very long way of saying that we now know why war resumes at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign. We now know why it remains one of the dominant features of the reign. And we should equally adjust ourselves intellectually to comprehending that, to stop attaching too much importance to neo-pacifist figures. Well, an actual pacifist figure, that's Erasmus, and an occasionally pacifist figure like Thomas More. In other words, the beginning that with this revision that I'm undertaking now, I think we really need to rebalance our approach to the whole period.
The interesting thing there is that he essentially received a quasi-European education.
Totally.
Which, given that we all think of him as the quintessential English king, I think the contrast there is quite interesting.
It's wonderful, and indeed you put your finger on it. That first exhibition, which I did in 1991, was called Henry VIII, a European court in England. And that's exactly what it is. And again, you see, you look, it's one of the things that we have to do with English history. You always have to remember that we are an offshore island. And remember, for most of the Middle Ages, the Channel is not a barrier. It's a means of communication. And the fact, of course, that we're an island surrounded with water and extraordinary numbers of fine harbours means not that we are resistant to invasion, but that we're highly susceptible to invasion. On the other hand, under Henry VIII, with all the importance of the new European techniques in language, in art, Holbein, the beginnings of the new architecture, all of that, what Henry's determination to get his divorce, and in order to get his divorce, make himself supreme head of the church, it does produce a genuine rupture. It produces an intellectual rupture between England and continental Europe and Catholic Europe, Christendom, as it then was, which turns England into a pariah state. England becomes a pariah state.
Because people do refer to that as the first Brexit, which I'm never sure whether that's lazy thinking or there is something to it.
I was the first lazy thinker.
Okay, fine. I'll take it back.
No, I think there's the arguments are remarkably similar. The arguments were essentially that we were part of a supranational entity that wasn't delivering as far as England was concerned. And Rome had all sorts of... And it's recognised. I mean, after all, what was the European Union founded in and by? The Treaty of Rome. The EU consciously looks back to two things. It looks back to the Roman Empire, and it looks back to the Catholic Church. And that many of remember, the founding fathers of the EU are profoundly influenced by Catholic doctrine. The whole doctrine of the common good, they're Christian. Every one of them is one sort or another of a Christian Democrat. They see a supranational, legally bound entity. The Church had a separate system of law. It had a separate system of promotion. It had a separate language, Latin. You see, the resemblances are very, very striking indeed. So England becomes a pariah state. And in that sense, I suppose we can see Henry VIII as a rather brighter, taller, better-looking version, and with better hair, Boris Johnson. You can see that. But I think at least as important is the way in which his Brexit, the Reformation, unlike our Brexit, had real consequences. I mean, what is striking, and I think people are right, is that the Brexit that we've had is really a brino. Brexit in name only. I know legally it's been complete, but there have been very, very few real consequences as far as...
But that's because, I mean, we're slightly straying off now, but that is, I think, largely because...
Come on, your expertise,
well,
yes.
I think it's because of the incompetence of government ministers.
Precisely. Whereas Henry had highly competent ministers and was a highly competent king, and they knew what they were doing. And I use that phrase, pariah state. The first thing that happens when that pariah status becomes absolutely clear, which is when I referred to the Habsburgs, now the dominant power in Europe, but counterbalanced by the French, when they actually come together in the Treaty of Nice in 1539 with an intention of launching a crusade against England. Henry does something completely extraordinary. You reconceive of England as an entity. You, for the first time, really see it. We constantly think of it as an island. Remember, for most of the kings you've been dealing with in the Middle Ages, it's not. It's part of a cross-channel empire. Henry consciously conceives of it as an island. And because we haven't finished.
No global England in those days.
Oh, yeah, and the island is also global, because remember, that island status is the foundation for the globalization of Elizabeth and Henry's daughter. And what happens is, Henry is also, we haven't finished with his education, he's a fine mathematician, he understands ballistics, and he's very interested in architecture, and very interested, he sees when he's a young man on that first summer at court, he sees the extraordinary Queenborough Castle built by Edward III, which is this study in geometry. It's a study in circles. And he uses that as the model for the fortresses that he then surrounds the whole of England with. I mean, in 1539, using a huge chunk of the wealth of the monasteries, he begins the first, since the Romans, the first pan-British scheme of fortification. But it's not the land frontier with Scotland, it's the whole of the coast. It's staggering. You've got we're talking about competence. This government has got the machine to survey the entire coastline, to come up with that. You haven't quite yet perfected our notion of mapping, but you produce these semi-perspective drawings of each main harbour. They're all filed in Whitehall in the King's New Palace. You've got special drawers. You've got a huge slate-top table on which utterly level, on which you can draw. And we have Henry's own handwriting all over these things, looking at where the gun emplacements and whatever should be placed. You redevelop the navy, the thing that I was involved with for so many years, the Mary Rose. You invent the idea of the warship. This ship where you don't have little light guns on castles at the end, but you have thundering great cannon in the belly of the ship with gun ports and so on. And alongside that, there's a reinvention intellectually of England. We talked about Latin. Henry's reign is also fundamentally important from the point of view of English. When you make England, when you make England a separate church, the Church of England, with the king as head of it, suddenly the language assumes this different status. They're determined to make English a great tongue. And it's one of the things I've written both a lot about Elizabeth, but also about Henry. So much that we think is Elizabeth is actually Henry. Clearly the great flowering of English, the first great flowering of English, which, by the way, is a result of a collision between Latin and the still very heavily Germanic English of the late Middle Ages. You get a collision of these two cultures with the extraordinary, the thing that is supposed to be such a terrible thing, cultural appropriation, is the vital thing that drives civilization. The peculiarity of Europe, but particularly the peculiarity of England and English. It's the hit of German and Latin, of a Germanic, Low German and in High Latin. And the English language is reconstructed under Henry. It acquires a vastly greater vocabulary, and all the things that we think of as being characteristic of Shakespeare, the sonnet, blank verse, they're all invented under Henry in this extraordinary cauldron, this explosive moment of the Reformation. So the Reformation, we're all right. Yes, the Reformation was hideously destructive. The monstrous damage of not simply to the physical fabric of the church, but to the fabric of people's lives. Yes, there's all that. But there's something that's also staggeringly creative, and the king is at the heart of it. My old teacher, Geoffrey Elton, Henry's a bit of a baby and a bit of a booby. My God, what he would have done to dear Geoffrey. Poor old Elton had this bizarre notion that Thomas Cromwell's endeavours were about making Henry VIII redundant. Even when I was a student, I had the wit to say to him, Geoffrey, when do you think Thomas Cromwell explained to Henry VIII that he was redundant? I would have thought about 6 hours before a specially inexperienced executioner.
Do you think that, I mean, we look at all the monarchs that we've had since Alfred, many of them have had long-term consequences for the country in one way or another, either the political system, society in general, the monarchy itself. But I can't think of another one whose legacy has lasted as long as Henry VIII. And
William the Conqueror.
Really?
Oh, yes. I mean, the conquest, again, completely reorientates England. England, if there hadn't been the conquest, we would really have been part of Scandinavia. Would have been Greater Scandinavia. England, in other words, the thing that would have shaped England would have been the North Sea. What happens with the Norman conquest is that England is pulled decisively south. And of course, the conquest has an even greater impact on language than Henry VIII's reign. It lays the foundation of English because it obliterates Anglo-Saxon as a written language. I mean, remember what was peculiar about Anglo-Saxon England was that you used the vernacular for government business. You keep the records of the nation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is in Anglo-Saxon, it's not in Latin. And all of that is swept away. And instead, you produce this extraordinary world of medieval England in which there are three languages. There is the Latin, the language of the church and high administration. There's French, which is the language of the upper class and chivalry. And there's Grunt, which is the peasant dialect. I mean, it's wonderful.
Which we still have.
Well, no. It's always been elevated, darling, because look at the word like elevated. I mean, again, Shakespeare. I mean, I just saw the most awful production of Macbeth at the Globe. It was an utter... How you can make that play both boring and silly is beyond me. They succeeded triumphantly. But look at that line in Macbeth when poor old Lady Macbeth is going on about the blood and she can't get it off her hands. Rather than getting the blood off my hands, it will... make the multitudinous seas in Carnadine, making the green one red. Latin, German. And it's quite extraordinary. The language just juxtaposes. By the way, we even know what it sounds like. We know the battle cries at Hastings. The Norman knights, Dieu aide, God help us. The housecarls round King Harold, oot, 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 oot. You know, out, 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 Arthur Scargill.
Or out of the EU.
Yeah, indeed, out, out, out.
Well, that is interesting because I suppose you can argue, well, you just have that effectively that period under William the Conqueror, that still has consequences
Huge.
Today. But I would also still argue that Henry VIII does.
I would agree.
And I mean, certainly if you look at the period up to, I don't know, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, the reverberations
are still there.
Were still there. I mean, they still are to an extent now.
Northern Ireland.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it's even further than that. You see, again, if I go back to I've been laughing at Geoffrey Elton, and I nevertheless owe him a profound debt, and I'd like to acknowledge it with something else that I'm doing at the moment. Geoffrey had this, I think, bizarre idea that Thomas Cromwell was about making government depersonalised, bureaucracy, replacing the king. This is nonsense. But something did happen. There was an extraordinary change in government. It wasn't just that the king became head of the church. And again, it's something that has always governed my history, which I think was rather unusual, certainly when I was a very young man, which is a sense of place, of buildings, of things, of pictures, the thinginess of history. And again, I had a second mentor when I first came to London. It was wonderful old Hugh Murray Bailey, a really outrageous, high intellectual queen, who was the head, the deputy secretary of the Historical Manuscripts Commissioner. There's a wonderful story that when he died unexpectedly, his desk was filled not with ancient manuscripts, but with exquisitely drawn pornography. But this is another matter. But Hugh introduced me to art, to buildings, to thinking about them seriously. And I owe him a profound debt, because the key, again, I talked when I wanted to describe this business of the consequences of England's pariah status. I talked about things. I talked about fortification, about ships, as well as the idea of England as being separate. Interestingly enough, that idea of England as a fortified island is, of course, Shakespeare. Henry VIII's propaganda of the 1540s underwrites John of Gaunt's great speech in Henry IV, where this jewel set in a silver sea and all this land of England and all the rest of it is taken directly from Henry VIII's propaganda. But what Henry does, again, it can be best, in terms of government, can be best expressed in two buildings. There are two buildings which you talk about when you talk about politics. We talk about Westminster and we talk about Whitehall. And Henry is the inventor of Whitehall. And what you do is you create two palaces directly next to each other in London. And in the old palace, the Palace of Westminster, there is Parliament, the law courts, the Exchequer. All of those are conduct their business in the name of the king. Even in the House of Commons, you've got the royal arms over it and all the rest of it, but the king is never there, or there only on the rarest, most formal occasions. On the other hand, in the new palace, Henry's palace, the Palace of Whitehall, just up the road, the king is there, and what the instruments that Geoffrey thought were about depersonalising government, the Privy Council. Look at the word Privy Council. Why the devil is it called Privy? Because it literally meets in the room opposite the king's bedroom. That's right. And the royal secretary, why is he called the secretary? Secrets, because his clerks are in the room next to the royal bedroom. In other words, these are the secretary and the council. These are the agents of a much more immediate type than anything that you had in the late Middle Ages. These are the agents of the king's real will. So you have a tension, Ian, just quickly, between two different views of monarchy. In other words, Henry really leaves the legacy that eventually is going to shape the Civil War. The religious tensions on the one hand, but also this tension between what is a monarchy about? Is it the actual will of the individual king, or is it the monarch as the guarantor of stability, of legality, of the way we should do things?
And it's an early version, the way you describe it, as separation of powers.
Yes, but you see, right. Now that's very interesting, except that we don't take that as the solution. We do something much more interesting. There is no separation of powers in England until it was catastrophically introduced under New Labour, with the resulting constitutional instability and the diminution of Parliament that we have now. We've just had a state opening of Parliament. What is represented in Parliament? There is the monarch, there are the judges, there's the church, there is the peerage, there's the Commons, there's everybody. Traditionally, Parliament represents everybody and does everything. How can you have a separation of powers when the chief executive, that's the Prime Minister, sits in the most important house of the legislature and normally controls it, which the Prime Minister does? And what's important to understand is the way we solve that conundrum between the will of the king as individual will and Parliament as representing the broader will of the nation. The way we solved it was inventing the position of a second king. That's called the office of Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, this again, I do hope this was. I haven't read your volume on Prime Minister.
Honestly, he contributes to all these books and then doesn't read them.
I did. If you knew how many real books. But the office of Prime Minister, as it's invented by that astonishing figure Robert Walpole in the 1720s, the office of Prime Minister is the key element in our constitution, which is why things have been so disastrous with the catastrophic premiers of the last I would say 30 years. What the office is designed to do, it's Janus-like. It's got two faces. It controls the monarch on behalf of Parliament, so only the Prime Minister can speak for the monarch. And remember, we're still ruled by the royal prerogative. We are still ruled, but we're not ruled by Parliament. You're ruled by orders in council. You're ruled by the civil service, which is a crown service, and all the rest of it. But the monarch can't exercise that power. Everything is done on the advice of the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister controls the monarch on behalf of Parliament, but equally he controls Parliament on behalf of the monarch using the machinery of patronage.
Anyway, back to Henry VIII.
No. But this is what I'm saying is Henry VIII sets up the central tension of not simply in religion but in government that runs right. That runs actually right through to now.
Now, listen, we have about 10 minutes left because I have an appointment with Sir Clifford Richard, which I cannot miss. So I want to spend the last 10 minutes trying to go through Henry's life, but looking at it through the prism of achievement and failure. It's very interesting in your chapter in the book. Everyone thinks of Henry VIII and the six wives. That's the immediate thought. You didn't really go into that at all.
No.
And I think you didn't even mention four of them.
No.
And you've only mentioned one of them in our conversation so far, which indicates to me that he shouldn't be remembered for the six wives.
Of course the wives are important. And of course that latter story is again, because you see, Henry isn't just history. The Tudors aren't just history. The Tudors are the English-Greek myths. They are mythic. There is history and there is myth. And it is, I think, deliberate on the part of the Tudors. They deliberately mythologize themselves, and they have image makers that the rest of us would die for. If you've got Holbein controlling your image, that image of Henry, talking again of the visual, that image of Henry that Holbein creates, you look at the mincing Louis XIV, Rigaud's version of Louis XIV, all like this on high heels, looking like Macron on a bad day. Whereas Henry, this extraordinary, and underneath all and this again was Geoffrey Elton, underneath all the elaboration of that portrait, it is cubist geometry. You've got the trapezium of the body, you've got two triangles of the arms, you've got the splayed columns of the legs, you've got the inverted triangle of the codpiece. Because Henry's a rugby player, there's no difference between his head and his neck. It's a solid cylinder. And then there's just a single broken line of the hat. This is why it goes into the mind. I remember, it's the only thing I remember about Geoffrey Elton's lectures. Shameful. Henry VIII is the only king whose shape you remember.
Yeah.
Now that's something.
Well, possibly Queen Victoria.
Yeah, but a king.
Okay, if you want to be a peasant,
we can't be. Oh, indeed, Queen Elizabeth. You remember the shape of Queen Elizabeth?
Well, only because
of the dresses.
You saw her so often. But
no, I don't. No, I meant Queen Elizabeth I, the real Queen.
Oh,
Elizabeth.
I see. I
think
possibly.
Sort of, yeah, the hair and the dress.
But I would say Victoria on the par with.
Yes. Victoria as that kind of little undercooked cottage loaf, as Geoffrey Elton once described a very important archivist at Cambridge who had a similar dumpy figure. You see where I get it from. Yes.
I do, yes.
He said, heaving a sigh of horror.
Thinking, only 8 minutes to go. He can't possibly say something more controversial. What were his failures as a king?
Oh, there were many. He fails really to deal properly with the succession. But of course that then leads to this extraordinary.
He did have a good try, though.
Well, indeed, but it leads to the normalisation of female succession. Remember, we always forget this because we're so used to female monarchs. We had no female monarch before Henry. It is Henry. The extraordinary paradox. You tear the world apart to get a son, and then you lay the foundations for the security of female succession.
Nearly had Matilda.
No, you didn't. Matilda is never queen. She's Lady of the English. She's never crowned because the Londoners...
No, she wasn't crowned, but there was a short period.
But she doesn't appear...
And she's in the books.
Well, she shouldn't be.
Well, yeah, I knew you'd say that. But
then there
are three others it probably shouldn't be either.
No, exactly. But she's never recognised, whereas Jane Grey is.
Yeah.
But in other words, it's Henry. Well, it's Henry, and then above all, it's Elizabeth. That clearly Mary, for various reasons, makes a bad fist of it. Elizabeth makes, within limits again, and there were great failures there too, an astonishingly good fist of it. And it just normalizes female succession, to the point of which, when you get the next queen regnant, when you get, well, sort of Mary, but doesn't really count, as the government was in the hands of William. But when you get the next queen regnant, Anne, she consciously evokes even Elizabeth's motto, the semper eadem and all the rest of it.
What about the condition of the people during his reign?
Let me tell you Henry's contribution to the condition of the people. When there was a rising in Lincolnshire in 1536, before it turned really serious and he thought he could just squidge it as he usually did these things, this is how he addressed the people of Lincolnshire, who had ventured quite politely to write to him that the people of one of the most brute and beastly shires of the realm should dare to address...
Nothing changes.
Let me just comment. Their sovereign majesty was as though the foot should address the head. So, nobody pretended much to care about democracy in those days. On the other hand, there's an immense liveliness and understanding. Henry is profoundly aware of the nature of popularity. There is extraordinarily active government propaganda. Again, remember, for the first 20-odd years of his reign, Henry is one of the most popular of monarchs. It is the great division of the divorce from Catherine. The first time confronts Henry with unpopularity. And you can pin it down to an actual moment, Ian. It's the trial, the Blackfriars trial of his marriage in 1529. And they were staying at the palace on one side. There was a town palace on one side. It's where Blackfriars Bridge is, and where the Fleet the River Fleet debouches into the Thames at that point. And there was a bridge over that took you from Bridewell into Blackfriars, the great monastery. And it was a bridge of size. It was an open bridge, and of course normally when the king crossed from the palace to the monastery for a parliament, or in this case for the trial, there'd be crowds below. Henry. What happened was the Queen, Catherine, is cheered when she goes over. The king is hissed. And I don't think he ever forgot that. And you can see, if you look at his reign, that he is toying with the idea of building a palace actually in the city that would have complemented the Tower, probably some great riverside palace or another. Instead, what happens is the shift to Westminster, and again, it's this sense of popularity, this sense of that at that key moment, London had turned against him. So he's profoundly aware. On the other hand, the structures of England hold, the power structures of England hold. Remember, there are no armed forces. And the way you maintain control, again, I haven't read the chapter on Henry VII. the conventional...
Well, it starts off with Henry VII is without doubt the greatest monarch of all of the ones that are covered in this book.
And what a funny kid. So does everybody begin.
That's just to encourage you to read it, because Nathan Amin, who wrote it,
yeah,
he was determined to restore Henry VII's reputation, and he does a good job of it.
No, Henry VII, indeed, but one of the conventional things that's said about Henry is that he suppresses bastard feudalism. That's the business of the upper class, having servants who look very much like modern football hooligans. They wear colours and they have badges, and they are effectively armed thugs, and they form the backbone of military force. And the conventional way it's described, Henry VII outlaws this. He doesn't. He monopolizes it. He takes it over. And the Tudors, to coin another phrase for you, become the biggest bastard feudal lords of them all. And that structure under Henry VIII holds. And Henry VIII develops it. And you can see it experiencing profound tensions, the great rising in the north of 1536, which, if I'd been, you only gave me 6,000 words. But what I wanted to do, Ian, was to do an essay that made people think.
Well, you've achieved that.
And I wanted
really
them
have.
to think differently, because there's been a lot of rubbish written about Henry. The worst rubbish recently is that his life was changed by a blow to the head. The evidence for this in 1536 is very dubious, but what is very striking, of course, is that the worst things that Henry does, like the execution of Thomas More and the execution of John Fisher, take place the year before the blow on the head. So clearly the blow on the head can't be it. And what I try to argue here, and we haven't talked about it, and we haven't even mentioned her, it's the great second wife, it's Anne Boleyn, and the moment of Henry deciding again for love. Absolutely for love. His letters are even signed with hearts, Henry loves Anne, sort of thing. Looks for nobody else and whatever. Henry, with that second love affair, because there'd been one love affair with Catherine, his entire world turns to 180 degrees. And that what he loved, he comes to hate, and what he'd hated, he comes to love. And it seems to me, knowing a lot of men, especially having undergone the torment of divorce. Remember, Henry's divorce, that the whole of that lasts for 7 years. At a time when life expectancy is in the 40s. I think it just transforms him. We need to have that sense of the pivot, but we also need to have the sense, which again I tried to convey, that this extraordinary story of his upbringing, of the role of first of women, the role of Erasmus and Erasmian Latin, and then the role of Castiglione and the normalization of force, violence, warfare. If you put all those things together, you can see the package, you can see the foundations, you can see the instruments that turn him into this most extraordinary man.
One of the objectives of this book, and indeed this podcast series, is to encourage people to read more about the monarch that they find really interesting. And I think both from your essay and what you said over the last 45 minutes or so, I think that achieves its aim, because I think people will, those people who only knew about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, I think will want to know more. So thank you very much indeed for not only your essay, but taking part in this podcast.
And as always, Ian, a great pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, if you've enjoyed this podcast, do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. Leave 5-star reviews if you would. That would be very nice of you. And also, buy the book, £25 hardback from Hodder and Staunton. It's an audio book as well. You have to forgive me for my pronunciations of Anglo-Saxon monarchs, particularly their wives, and also as an e-book. Join us again next week. Goodbye.